Well, it's my task to speak late this afternoon and wrap up our event. We do have a seminar after this, but at which time you will have your chance to wrap up the event and provide your thoughts on both the readings and the things that you've learned. But it's also my job to try and bring everything together in a way that provides some meaning and encouragement for you over, well, until next year when you get to come back. And that's always a monumental task, and I hope I can do it justice. Several folks this afternoon said, "Oh, you've got a big lecture ahead of you, right, Carey? And you're going to make us proud, right, Carey?" And the pressure has mounted, and I'm just collapsing under the pressure of federal social engagement. So what I want to do here at the beginning of this presentation is to go over a little bit more about what we've talked about, what I began the week off, discussing the difference between a modern society and what we probably ought to call a federal society. And I'm following Bill Wilson's routine here of using PowerPoints. And I want to show you graphically what these two societies look like. I think that's very helpful. I think it will convey to you a little more meaning than what I've already provided. Those of you on this side of the room, sorry, y'all got to figure something out. But here is essentially a modern social order. You have either a despot or some sort of sovereign authority at the top. Usually, maybe not a king. No European king was ever totally sovereign. This would essentially be the modern state. So you'd have the modern state on top. You would have at the bottom individuals, using the word very carefully, individuals, a collection of individuals who are all equal, who are all able to exercise one share of ownership in that society, and essentially they behave as a kind of corporation. And then between the state and the individuals are intermediary institutions, what Tocqueville called intermediary institutions. Edmund Burke called these the little platoons that linked the past to the present. These intermediary institutions, if you'll note here in my wonderful PowerPoint, are really filters between the individuals that comprise society and the state at the top. So let me give you, for those of you who are students and you are taking notes, let me give you a few points about this. Number one, as I said earlier, the individual is the basic building block. That is upon what society rests. An individual, a self-contained, autonomous, pleasure-seeking, or should I say pleasure-maximizing individual. A corpuscle in the larger body politic, or as I mentioned earlier, a stockholder in the greater corporation. Number two, these intermediary institutions are just that. They are intermediary. They have no intrinsic value. They serve no purpose except to facilitate communication and services between the individuals and the state. If the state can do it better, then fine. Let the state do it. Likewise, if solitary individuals could do it better, then there's no need for either state action or for any of these intermediary institutions to come about. In other words, the measure of an association's effectiveness is not how well its interests are met, but how well it helps either individuals or the state. So everything then is ultimately subsidiary either to the welfare of the state or the welfare of these autonomous, pleasure-maximizing individuals. And if anything undermines either of those, then that institution is held in suspect. Number three, there is a constitution for these kinds of societies, these modern societies. But it's really more of a systematic statement of purposes. And we see this in a variety of constitutions in the 19th and 20th century. Now, the United States Constitution has a preamble, and in that preamble there is a kind of statement of purpose. It's very general. It sounds really good. When I was growing up, we had songs that we could sing, and with Joe, I think it came on Saturday morning, and we the people. I'm not going to sing it for you, but we had these kinds of, it's kind of a basic thing. That's not the case with 19th and 20th century constitutions. There you see around the world deliberate statements of purposes for what that society is trying to achieve. To use the words of Michael Oakeshott, which Mel Bradford relied upon quite heavily over the course of his life, these constitutions were teleocratic documents. These were teleocratic societies. They had a telos, they had a purpose, they had an end. They were all trying to reach some particular point in both time and space. Number 4, and this is where we start getting to the meat of the things. If this society is based on individuals, then every effort is made to ensure that the individuals who comprise that society are in fact good or purposeful or otherwise contributing to the whole. The goal is getting the right individuals in positions of power. So if anything goes wrong with this, it's because the individual that you've chosen to run this is somehow an ill fit for that position. They're corrupt, they're unvirtuous, they smell bad. I mean, whatever the case may be, they're the wrong individual for that job. Forrest McDonald, in his important book on the American Revolution and the Constitution, Novus Ordo Seclorum, in the ideological origins of the Constitution, argued, and I think quite successfully, that early Americans were divided between two different groups of leaders. Those who thought virtue was most important in ensuring that the constitutional order would be maintained, and those who insisted that we've got to strike the right balance. We've got to get the institutions right first. That's what's most important. And I'll talk more about that in just a second. But again, for MacDonald, and in this kind of modern society, ensuring that enough people possess the right frame of mind, the right virtue, or the right moral righteousness is the primary goal of the political process, and from that, then, the educational system. If something goes wrong, it's because unvirtuous people are in charge. Those of you who are old enough, think back to the scandals of the Clinton era in the 1990s. Yes, think back. Of course, as you know, we're all going to be thinking back to those scandals in coming days. But time and time again, conservatives argued the problem was Bill Clinton. He couldn't keep his hands to himself. The problem was him. He was an unvirtuous person. He was a sexual predator. All that's probably true. But never did one major conservative or Republican leader suggest that perhaps the office of the presidency has gotten too powerful. It was never a question of the institution. It was always a matter of the person in charge. Well, how do we know if these people lack virtue? And that brings us to the fifth element that I would describe in this modern order. And I've said this before at a number of summer schools and in other Abbeville lectures, so you can go and buy these from Mike and review this if you want, where I go into more detail. The greatest fear of people who defend the modern society, the greatest fear for these folks are centrifugal forces tearing off individuals from the larger body. So they're always worried about individuals spinning off from the larger system, which is one of the reasons why they're very critical of intermediary institutions, because occasionally those intermediary institutions can claim enough authority that they can convince people to actually leave or to otherwise challenge those people who are at the top. This is another reason why moderns, I'm using that term somewhat generically, from the 18th century forward, really appreciated the classical Republican fear of a powerful personality or otherwise a powerful person being able, through demagoguery and intrigue, to sort of tear off a huge chunk of society or even take it over altogether. This is why they worried in the 18th and 19th century about Napoleonic figures. It's why you see early American leaders under the Constitution voicing concern about demagoguery. It's why you see them voicing concern about a cabal taking over the national government. A cabal, like a small group of people who are real sneaky, and they secretly take over the government, like the slave power. You see this in so many northern writers. You see this in some southern writers too, not worried about a slave power, but worried about moneyed interests have gained control of the government. There's some truth to some of these, but otherwise tearing people away. So that's the fear. That's modern society. Everybody with me? Modern society. Now, we push the slide forward. And here is a rough drawing of a federal order, a federal society. Note that in the center of this is not an individual, but what? A person. A person is in the middle. This is a real person. This is not the fake people. This is not the individuals. Notice these people don't have any faces, right? This guy's got a face, and he's happy. He's smiling. If you can't see it in the back, just trust me. The fundamental building block in a federal society is the first association in which people enter that society. And for those of you who may have not been properly educated about the birds and the bees, the first association in which people enter that society is through a family. Y'all know what a family is? Do I need to explain that? But families are the building block. It's through families that people learn about this society. It's through families that people form their first associations and their first social arrangements. And those of you who have children, you're well aware that children are not born into this world loving others. They have to be taught. They have to be instructed. They have to learn to work and live with their siblings. Some do it better than others. But that's the first point of this. Families are the fundamental building block. Now, what I have done, and I don't expect any of you to be able to read these, but I've listed the names of different types of associations and relationships that revolve around this person. And the number two, the second thing to keep in mind about this, the second thing is that associations and relationships are not mere appendages of this person. They are, in fact, what makes up this society. If you remove all this clutter, there's nothing left except this poor guy, and he's not going to have a smiley face anymore. He's going to be Robinson Crusoe, and he's going to be very, very upset. These associations have intrinsic value because they consist of self-serving persons seeking to mutually benefit each other. Now, I've listed some of these. First, there's the person's spouse, the person's parents, the person's children, the person's employer, the person's colleagues at work, farmers in Salinas, California, who provide lettuce for this person to eat at the salad bar at the summer school that he attends. There's the car manufacturer and all the employees and people who go into the manufacturing of that car. There's the person's homeowners association, the person's health care provider and network. There's Congress. There's Fox News. The person's neighbors. Governments at many different levels. I put some other things here. I've got a restaurant. I've got a couple of department stores. The cable company, yes, that is an intermediary institution. That is an association. It's one we all collectively hate. But the cable company, nonetheless, is a group of persons mutually working to try and benefit each other. Maybe at the expense, but, nonetheless. Walmart, football, the sports the person likes, the person's church. All of these are associations. Now, what I've done is taken a few of these and I've drawn colored lines to illustrate the claims that each of these associations makes upon this person. Every morning when this person wakes up, he's got to decide which of these associations' claims are going to be a priority, which ones are going to be prioritized, which ones are going to have the most claim upon his existence that day. His wife would like to have total claims upon him that day. His parents, who don't get along with his wife, also think they should have claims upon him. His boss wants every ounce of his living being and would prefer to suck it from him, even in his sleep. Well, I could give all sorts of examples of this. The problem is they all make claims. Now, some don't make absolute claims. Walmart only wants his money and will be happy to supply some product, good or bad, to get that. There is, and this is the third point on the federal order, corresponding to the third point of the previous one, there is a constitution here. But that constitution refers to how these things are arranged or how these things actually arrange themselves over time. They're all making claims. They're all jockeying for power. They're all claiming allegiance and wanting more and more of it and essentially balancing things out. And that is the real focus of the Constitution for this kind of federal society. It's about balance. It's about helping persons understand how to interact within each of these institutions in such a way that he can wreak out a meaningful existence. Each one of these associations has its own rules. Each one of these associations has its own habits, its own character. And the goal of the person is to understand how these rules and habits and goals operate so that he can better interact and balance these associations out in his life. That's a difficult thing because it means you've got to understand how a lot of different people act and how the same people are going to interact differently within a different situation. It's very situational. Can I say that word, I hope? I'm not talking about situational ethics, but some ways I am. It is situational in the sense that each of these associations has a kind of ethic in itself. It's also important to note that IQ and wealth are not a measure of how well this person is going to interact within this federal society. A person can be pretty dumb, but still be able to manage and understand the unwritten rules that govern a lot of these associations. A person can be poor. In fact, a person can be really good at managing these associations and never have enough sense to make money out of it, but still live a very productive life. Number 4, as I mentioned earlier, just to reiterate that, what matters most here is striking the right balance. Make no mistake, in a federal society, you can create so many associations that a normal human being will be crushed under their weight. And this is one of the reasons why the Jeffersonian Republicans, Thomas Jefferson in particular, was so worried about urbanization and big cities. Because ultimately, Jefferson and John Taylor and Nathaniel Bacon and others believed that in large urban areas there would be so many associations that persons would quite literally crush under their weight. They just could not humanly manage all of this. Nathaniel Bacon, a senator from North Carolina, famously quipped that he never wants to build a house close enough to his neighbor to hear his dogs barking at night. Yeah, I can understand that. Well, number 5, the greatest fear of people who defend this kind of federal order are not centrifugal forces, but the opposite, centripetal, with a P, centripetal forces, crushing and overwhelming the person. This is again why the Jeffersonians used one word over and over again. Calhoun's going to use this. Jefferson Davis is going to use this. Albert Taylor Bledsoe is going to use this. Robert Louis Dabney is going to use this. And it's still going to be used in some Southern conservative circles in the early 20th century. And that's going to be the term consolidation. That's what they are worried about. And when they talk about consolidation, they're talking about these associations being centralized and exerting enough power to genuinely make a total claim on a person's allegiance and life. The Southern agrarians will change that a little bit and use the term industrialization, but I think may not be exactly the same, but there is a strong link between those two. Now, how does this... Let me explain one more thing about this before I move on to the 20th century. And reiterate, ladies and gentlemen, it is very difficult living in this kind of world. It's not easy. It's a lot easier, right? It's a whole lot easier living over here. Everybody's faceless. These institutions come and go. They're like they're on a highway moving back and forth. The only thing I really need to worry about is that which is on top, the elite or the those who actually control and a kind of total power over that society. This is hard. Not everybody fits into this. Not everybody is assimilated through a wholesome family experience such that they learn how to fit into this kind of world. They learn how to understand the unwritten rules of these different associations. They learn how and are habituated into a kind of practical virtues that cause people to live at peace with others. Not everybody has that. And in the modern world, as these associations will sort of increase over the 19th and early 20th century, stress began to be seen. Depression, suicide, criminal behavior, impoverishment. While these are not exclusively due to this one factor, we do see increased instances of these things as the complexity of societies increase. Well, some people learn that instead of fitting in, instead of learning the rules of these associations, you can kind of jump ship. You can promote yourself above and beyond these different associational ties. And as I've argued before, this is one of the reasons why New Englanders are so peculiar. It's one of the reasons why the way New Englanders handle wealth is different from the way 19th century Southerners handled wealth. Now, you go down to Charleston and you see magnificent mansions. I mean, this is an incredible thing. But they're symmetrical, they are balanced, they're not gaudy. You go to Biltmore and you see gaudy. So there's a kind of gaudy wealth in New Englanders where they're wearing their wealth on their sleeve. They're wanting to make sure you know that they were wealthy. Keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that the average Southern planter who's at the top of Southern society, the average Southern planter did not live in a palatial mansion. They did not live on Rainbow Row or the Battery. They did not live at Drayton Hall or Mount Vernon. The average Southern planter lived in a wood-framed house that was only marginally superior in construction and insulation to that of their slaves. We don't see those houses anymore. You know why? Because they were crappy houses. And they got torn down, they burned, or they just rotted out. What we have left is the very best. We don't really see what way most of them live. And so, for those who learn that they don't have to really follow all the rules, they can adopt an ideology. Through ideology or philosophies or religious efforts that reward not only their self-righteousness, but reward those who spend their day promoting themselves as social reformers, or at least better than everyone else, that they can kind of jump outside of this society. And that's a little difficult to explain, and I don't want to go into great detail on this, except that what kind of happens here is that the people who don't really fit in very well, they're looking for someone who does. Because they want to find a model that they can follow. And so they're looking around, they're scanning the horizon, they're looking, and they can see Clyde. Great scholar, eminently known throughout the world, wonderful professor. And they see Clyde and they think, okay, Clyde's figured this thing out. Clyde has jumped out of this, and he's on top of this kind of federal society. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start modeling myself after Clyde. I'm going to smoke cigars. I'm going to grow a goatee. I'm going to come up with some really pithy slogans on my baseball caps that Clyde likes to wear. I'm going to be like Clyde. Now, that's great. If we were all like that, it might be okay. But understand that for every person who wants to be like Clyde, there are 10 million who want to be like Madonna, who look at these celebrities and say, all right, this person has figured this out, and I am going to skip all this other stuff that I should be learning and being enculturated into this society, and I'm going to be like that celebrity. Now, that's very different. I'm specifically talking to the young people here. That's very different from, deliberately learning these rules. And I like to tell my students, you should dress for the job you want, right? So if you want to be a banker, you need to. Well, if you want to be a banker, but if you want to be a banker, you need to dress like a banker. If you want to be a college professor, you need to dress like a college professor. That's very different from what I'm talking about here with the celebrity syndrome. In that world, in that situation, the person is really wanting the easy way out. And it's for this reason that these are very troubled people. Think back to your time in high school. Some of you, that was a long time ago, but you can still think back to it. There was always those few who just didn't seem to fit in. Did you ever notice how the people who didn't fit in always looked like everybody else who didn't fit in? You think about the 1960s and 70s. I can remember those times. The hippies. Did you ever notice how the hippies all looked alike? Even to the point of their hair. You put all hippies in a room and you couldn't distinguish between it was all the same. Men, women, all the same hair. In other words, these efforts to be an individual, almost invariably lead to conformity. Now, this is not unique to the 20th century. But it certainly happens a lot in the 20th century. And at the turn of that century, the beginning, progressive intellectuals like Oliver Wendell Holmes, Henry James, Woodrow Wilson, John Dewey, Florence Kelley, Jane Addams, Richard Ely, Herbert Crowley, and Frederick Taylor, and I can provide you those names later, it was simply easier to wipe this social organization out and start over along modern lines. Hence, in the early 20th century, progressives start pouring culture in from the top. By and large, American conservatives, over the course of the 20th century, agreed to resist progressive hopes of eliminating traditional aspects of American culture and then replacing them with new cultural forms based on liberal values. It's essentially what they tried to do. But what conservatives failed to agree upon was why such resistance was necessary. Some followed the reasoning of a long line of British conservative intellectuals, starting with Edmund Burke and other Augustan writers. They argued that human traditions serve useful purposes and that a well-ordered human society provided the stability and the social hierarchy needed to produce prosperity in a civilization. In effect, they defended traditions, all these little associations, all those rules, as a quote-unquote traditional social order, whatever that meant. In fact, scanning the pages of conservative thinkers' writings in the 1940s, the 1950s, and 1960s, one would really be hard-pressed to identify what actual traditions they sought to conserve. Instead, you see things or read things like, and this is particularly true among communists, the American way of life. Among others, it was social mores and values, or human decency, or my favorite, the permanent things. One of my first visits to a conservative student organization as a teenager, I was about 17, someone stood up and started talking about the permanent things. It was a great phrase. I loved it. I thought, wow, I'm going to start talking. I'm going to use that in my language. I had no clue what the permanent things were. It's a phrase coined by T.S. Eliot, by the way, and popularized by Russell Kirk. In many respects, the defense of tradition became abstracted from the social realities of American communal life and rarely focused on specifics. What were the permanent things? Was it a nuclear family? Was it praying grace before a meal? Was it keeping your hair cut short or listening to big band music? Were any specific patterns of life worth preserving in a world of seemingly profound change, as was the case in post-World War America? Russell Kirk, the father of a post-war conservatism, even once quipped that once you recognize something as a tradition, it immediately ceased to serve its useful purpose. Not coincidentally, most American conservatives embraced a strategy largely rooted in the very progressivism they claimed to resist. Shaped by both anti-communist and libertarian thought, conservatives spoke about principles and ideas that separated us from communists that were spreading from the East. Conservatives in the 1950s and 60s rediscovered the Republican language of the era of the American Revolution, and they found solace in the revolutionaries' commitment to virtue and constitutionalism. Natural rights, equality, liberty. Surely these ideas would provide a rallying point around which a new conservatism could coalesce and reclaim the lost ground given up to progressives. At least that was the argument in the 50s and 60s. And if not, if that wasn't enough, then libertarian, or what they call them, really neoliberal, I think is the proper term. They would call themselves libertarians or classical liberals. Libertarian economic thought would provide the necessary catalyst needed to enhance conservatism's place in post-war America. Here we would add to the permanent things individualism, capitalism, and property rights, joining a long list of conservative virtues and principles and other essential criteria by which to judge the worst government policies coming out of the New Deal, the Square Deal, and the Great Society. In effect, conservatives insisted that progressivism, like socialism, represented really bad ideas. Just bad ideas. Bad ideas. Make no mistake, they are bad ideas. But the conservative movement quickly became an academic enterprise where educating Americans, especially young Americans, about right ideas became paramount. And of course, progressives were doing exactly the same thing, especially from the 1960s forward. Now, let me provide something of an aside here on this. First of all, many of these conservative leaders themselves, and I know that many of you were connected with that movement for a long period of time. I'm not talking about anybody in this room. But many of these conservative intellectual leaders were really weird people. They didn't fit in. They didn't. They were odd. They were strange. They couldn't hold down regular jobs. They couldn't create their own institutions. Those that did were not the weird people, but nonetheless. Second of all, if we think about the 1970s, and I would like to say some positive things about the 1970s. I was born in the 1970s. I know it was a period of really bad fashion, really terrible hairstyles, really bad fashion, okay, I'm just putting that aside. But you know, the 1970s was really a resurgence of cultural conservatism. We came out of the 1960s, came out of the civil rights movement. People were proud of their culture. In the South, blacks and whites were equally proud of their various traditions and were equally able to celebrate those traditions in music, in food, in dance, and in symbols that they wore, flew, or otherwise displayed for everyone else. But if you were to ask people in the 1970s, and I'll come back to this here in just a few minutes, if you were to ask people in the 1970s who said they were conservative, and you ask, well, what is it you want to conserve? They would tell you real things. Well, I've got my family over here. I have my family traditions. Here's the things that we do. This is what I really want to protect. Decency, wholesomeness. Tom Fleming's wonderful presentation where he talked about children playing on the gravestones of their ancestors. I did that. I remember doing that. I don't know if my son remembers doing that. He was probably too little when it happened. But my children did that. And I can remember playing around a gravestone of my granddaddy, who I didn't know. He died a month after I was born. And someone hollered out, oh, don't let him do that. Don't let him do that. It's shameful. And my grandmother responded, his granddaddy would love for him to do that. Those are the kinds of things in the 70s we could talk about conserving. By the late 1980s, ask any college student, and certainly by the 90s, what it meant to be an American or what it is that you wish to conserve, and hardly any of them would respond referring to a single tradition or cultural habit. I used to do this all the time with my students. What do you want to conserve? What does it mean to be an American? Freedom, liberty, equality, freedom, liberty. And then finally they would all, I like one of those, liberty. So one of them would finally win out by the time we got it around the room. But it was always ideological. It was never, in any case, a single habit. Is it then any wonder that the cultural interests supposedly championed by both the left and the right found little help as the country sailed through the 20th century? Progressives did little, if anything, to help working-class Union towns any more than they helped urban black neighborhoods. Conservatives, likewise, did nothing to help rural communities or conservative towns and suburbs resist progressive efforts to reshape their societies. Why? Because actual culture did not matter to either side. Conservatives could deplore abortion, federal encroachments upon local education, the loss of public virtue, and the erosion of decency in Hollywood films, but they did little to define, support, or perpetuate those habits of common life that made life worth living. For the thousands of young people who flocked to conservative organizations and think tanks, starting in roughly the 1980s, hoping to find an intellectual defense of the world they sensed was slipping away, how disappointing it must have been to learn that all we can do is maximize individual liberty, protect property rights, and effectively ridicule those who thought otherwise. Well, let me end on a kind of happy note over the next 20 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, the modern world is disappearing. It is fading away before our eyes. I may be wrong about this, but I am the last speaker, so I am going to be hopeful. So if I am wrong, call me on it later. Let's think a little bit about the post-World War era that emerged in the 1940s and 1950s, really the pinnacle of modernity. Now, I took a shot at poor Russell Kirk a few minutes ago. Let me say something really positive about Kirk. Russell Kirk once wrote that the peak of American civilization was the dropping of atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That was the peak. I think he's probably right about that. And with that in mind, I would say the peak of modernity probably came about in the 1940s. What are some of the characteristics of that? First, globalism, connecting free, autonomous, and pleasure-maximizing individuals. An expansion of rights, every kind of right that you can think of. Bathroom rights. Pet rights. We're getting to the point where these rights are starting to sound like the names of obscure rock music gangs and bands. And pet rights. Hey, dude, you listened to Pet Rights last night. Yeah, okay. Global institutions, furthering the corporate and centralized organization of government. And then domestically, and I want to go into a little more detail here. Progressives and other modernists set about creating national institutions with a one-size-fits-all approach. Now, this is something of a continuum. It's not homogeneous in every case. What do these include? The public school movement, which was by the 1940s permanently in place. It's not until the 1940s that it's permanently in place. It's really relatively young. My parents' generation are the first generation where all Americans were expected to go to 12 years of public schooling, or some schooling. Suburban housing projects, all where houses basically all look the same. The interstate highway system. A national entertainment industry rooted in television programming, but also radio and film. A little bit more diversity in the film industry, but nonetheless. Culinary homogeneity, thanks to Betty Crocker and various national cookbooks. How many of us had to suffer under our mothers allocating one kind of meal to one weeknight every week? Meatloaf night, chicken night, salmon croquette night. Horrible, horrible, horrible. Thank you, Betty Crocker. Professions and professional accreditation and licensure organization, fostered and paid for by foundations like the Carnegie Foundation. Franchising and national branding. Aggressive efforts for national unionization, which were actually quickly stopped. This is one element of the New World Order that did not make it very far. A national evangelical religious social movement. National sporting leagues. And of course, major national government programs stemming from the New Deal, like Social Security and others. These things constituted the New World Order. These things constituted the pinnacle of modernity. And while they may not have all been that bad, nor were their cost that expensive in the short term. For this reason, Americans enjoyed rising standards of living, larger families, and a significant village to assist them in raising their children and educating them to appreciate all these institutions. But Americans continue to be shaped in a federal way. They continue to live their lives in a consistent pattern of a federal social order that it had existed since the colonial period. While progressives and ideologues of all stripes wanted this to be in place, this sort of system just didn't die very easily. It didn't go away. Capitalists and entrepreneurs were forced to capitulate to consumers who were still shaped by local customs and preferences, much to the chagrin of corporate executives who preferred to most cheaply produce one item that would be consumed by all Americans. Those of you who are the oldest in the room, you might remember going to a grocer and there would basically be one kind of rice, one kind of butter, maybe one kind of milk. You didn't have a lot of brand diversification. One kind of deodorant to the, poor Bernie Sanders doesn't like that. But this was essentially, this effort of having to appeal to persons and local customs and preferences was essentially the commercial pattern of the late 19th and early 20th century, when Americans were most impressed with new inventions and they were able to settle for only one form of those products. For this reason, something like the Sears Roebuck Company could produce a single national catalog of products, and people liked that. And when they got through with the catalog, they had all kinds of purposes for those pages in their outhouse. But after World War II, federally minded Americans wanted differentiated products, best suited to their locally formed preferences. So really, the point here, and to try and condense this a little bit, at the very beginning, cracks appeared in the post-war order, the New World Order of modernity. Companies responded to consumers with rapid diversifications of products and services, along with corresponding marketing campaigns. They had to decentralize. They had to federalize. By the end of the 1950s, Americans were being bombarded with a level of product sales in so many different ways it had never been seen before. In many ways, it was a new kind of sectional nationalism emerged in the 1950s. But unlike the early 19th century variety, where Yankees presented their social ideals as the real America, entrepreneurs and marketing agents found success in taking local products to national consumers, like Coca-Cola, or making local businesses into national chains, like McDonald's or Walmart. Other cracks soon appeared, and are too numerous, I think, to mention in the few minutes I have left. But let me just take one example: public schools. As I mentioned earlier, that a child would attend 12 years of public education is not really that old. It really commenced with the World War II generation. By the time that generation itself had reached high school, various culture and economic associations, these things right here, had already occupied America's public schools and had fragmented students into still fun in the 50s, but an uneasy collection of social groups: jocks, hayseeds, greasers. For you young people, if you young people may not remember the TV show Happy Days. My kids still watch Happy Days, right? You have an example of all those different groups. They're federal. It's a federal kind of high school. New groups emerged from the 1960s forward, and some of the other ones, thankfully, disappeared. Public schools promoted cultural change, but they also, in some ways, sustained types of local identity. This is not what progressives had in mind, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, in some ways, public schools became engines of a kind of social federalism, just to remain alive. And nothing proves this better, I think, than the adoption of school mascots and public school sporting teams, all of which were designed to support the local identity of students and their parents. That they further decentralized the education system, and much to the surprise and angst of national education intelligentsia, this is the only way of getting public schools funded. People wanted to support their local team, not so much their local school. And their local team were the rebels, or the generals, or some other good Confederate name, right? The war horses. I was the Panthers. What was that? Now, I could go through a list of all of these different elements of the post-war world order. Ladies and gentlemen, every one of them are in trouble. In the short term, the cost of maintaining this system has led to long-term debt. Professor Wilson mentioned the term $20 trillion in a current budget debt. The unfunded liabilities of debt in the United States now are anywhere between 80 to perhaps over $100 trillion. As I mentioned to some of the students, we are now more dollars in debt than there are stars in the known universe. You're not going to pay that off. I mean, really, it's just not going to happen. The national banking system has endured two major crises in my lifetime. The authority and legitimacy of the national government and local and state governments is at an all-time low. The support for national political parties is now at an all-time low. The only thing people support less than either the Democrats or the Republicans is Congress, which tells us a great deal. National entertainment networks are fragmented to the point where it's hard to say if any of the major networks that once existed in the 70s and 80s still exercise any significant dominance over national entertainment. Maybe Disney, maybe not. But where has conservatism been in all of this? Whether it be the influence of anti-communists, the even greater influence of new liberalism or libertarianism, the impact of political philosophers prone to abstractions and largely ignorant of a historical context, or the willingness of a political class eager to maintain their own power, conservatism by and large has not conserved very much. Together, they shaped a form of conservatism, as Clyde had mentioned earlier, quoting Robert Louis Dabney, a conservatism that has conserved virtually nothing at all. America was never, for these conservatives, these so-called conservatives, America was never a collection of identifiable traditions, but instead consisted of a set of ideas, of virtues, of principles. Entire forests were sacrificed in the 20th century so that conservatives could write and explain in ideological terms while they were not ideologues. And as I mentioned earlier, at the beginning of my life, one could ask, what it is it that you wish to conserve? And you got sensible answers. Two-parent homes, manners, simple worship at church, pleasing art, historic continuity in architecture, front porch communities, good food, wholesome entertainment, community events not run by the Parks and Rec department, but by volunteers, like the bicentennial celebrations in the 70s. Local determination of school curriculum, local dialects, being able to pass down family traditions and decency without fear of being ridiculed every step of the way. It's what people could conserve in the 70s. But once Republicans comfortably grasped power and Democrats no longer dominated American politics, Republican and movement conservative leaders cast aside cultural conservatives who were not welcomed back in the fold until the 1990s, when they sufficiently pledged fealty to ideological thinking. I think the best illustration of this is to compare Jerry Falwell's moral majority of the 1970s to Ralph Reed's Christian coalition of the 1990s. Arguably, journalists and others think that one just led to the other. These are two very different organizations, very different purposes, very different ways of thinking. Now, a great deal of juicy information came out of the conservative movement beginning in the spring of last year. What have we learned in the current presidential race? We have learned that self-proclaimed constitutional conservatives have little or nothing to do with the Constitution, but rather it reflects, as one said, a state of mind. We have learned that striking deals is less important than losing. Big time. Any mention of ethnic interests must be shut down as quickly as possible, as is any mention of religious or ethnic characteristics. We have learned, according to movement conservatives, that big money really has no control over the political system. Well, that's true if it's being spent by dumb Republican operatives. And lest we forget, as one writer in National Review instructed us, we have learned that working class communities deserve to die. Make no mistake, every criticism, I don't care whether you like Trump or not, it has nothing to do, I'm not promoting Trump. But make no mistake, every criticism levied against a certain presidential candidate of late exactly mimics the same denunciation the English levied against the Scots and Irish in the 17th and 18th century, and the North used against black and white Southerners in the 19th century. It is exactly the same. It's as if they picked up Grady McQuinney's cracker culture and they just started lifting lines. Oh, this can apply to Trump. Trump supporter. Yep, there you go. Notice also the conservative reaction to the three things that were really shoved in Americans' faces during the summer of 2015, the summer of infamy. Movement conservatives have neither the will, but most importantly, they lack the intellectual reserve to defend marriage, normal sexuality, and time-honored regional symbols. Those three things. So Caitlyn Jenner, the gay marriage decision, and attacks on the Confederate flag. These things simply don't fall any longer in the right categories of movement conservatism. They don't seem to fit the 10 founding principles, the 8 world views commonly taught in Christian schools, nor the 7 things we can learn from Abraham Lincoln. A recent writer, again in National Review, asked, what have conservatives done for us lately? And his response is, and I got to finish up here. I'm going to read this very quickly. Here's his response, and I'm quoting. Conservatives have made all sorts of changes to the baseline presumptions of American life. Baseline presumptions of American life. Baseline presumptions of American. Among these alterations are the tarring and feathering of the reflexively technocratic mindset that obtained from the outset of the New Deal to the end of the 1970s, the marginalization of wage and price controls and other centralizing tools, the lowering of destructive tax rates on income and other forms of wealth, the deregulation of a significant number of major industries, a renewed focus on national sovereignty. You can laugh, it's okay. The successful reform of the welfare system, a consensus around free trade, a much lower minimum wage, a focus on both the text and the original meaning of the Constitution when discussing limits on government power, the restoration of the right to keep and bear arms, the restoration of the right to keep and bear arms, the stronger protection of freedom of expression, a national partial birth abortion ban, the death of speech-killing campaign finance reform, and lest we forget, says this author, the peaceful dismantling of the Soviet Union. Notice that none of these things have anything to do with culture, daily custom, or the habits of common life. And I'm not even asking whether any of these things actually took place, and most of them did not, by the way, or whether conservatives could even take credit for them. The banning of cultural conservatism in the 1980s freed what was left of mainstream conservatism to follow ideological lines of thinking that many in this room warned about over a generation ago. And Tom. By the 1990s, conservatives valued ideas over tradition, virtue, and I'm putting that in quotation marks, over habit, intellectual purity, rather than treating politics as a series of deals and compromises, simplicity over complexity, universals rather than the particular, natural rights rather than historic privileges, and above all, they championed individuals, not persons. So let me leave you with this thought. We've been told that a revolution has taken place, that it began long ago. I agree with that. But all ideological movements, all of them, end up consuming themselves. French Revolution, nationalist movements in 19th century Europe and North America, fascism, communism, they all end up consuming themselves with one exception. If there's the presence of war, they're able to be sustained. So as long as there's warfare, they always end up collapsing. What will, when this revolution ends, what will reconstructed America look like? What's it going to look like? Will we look like the South when it was reconstructed? In other words, are we going to look like an impoverished a place of declining families, of political corruption, of destruction of social associations, a place of doctrinal corruption of its churches, diminished voting participation, and a net migration of its people to other parts of the world? Even the freedmen in the reconstructed South, freed slaves, found their standard of living declining to a point that the eminent historian C. Van Woodward argued with some degree of credibility that the quality of life of black Southerners in 1900 was worse than that of slaves in 1860. Is this America's future? Is this what reconstructed America is going to be like? Now that's the sad story. That says the South will endure and the South has something to offer other Americans because we have endured and survived what the rest of America may soon endure and also need to survive. But maybe there's another glimmer of hope. Maybe there's a glimmer of hope that instead of Reconstruction is our future, maybe Jacksonian democracy is our future. Maybe Americans are ready to recover self-government. Maybe Americans are ready to drop their ideological insistence on purity and come to terms that maybe we ought to win every now and then. Maybe we should cut deals. Maybe how we manage people is more important than turning society into a series of machines. Maybe Americans are realizing that their elites are crass, vain individuals who really aren't doing anything for us. Maybe Americans are prepared for genuine institutional reform and a recovery of genuine cultural conservatism and building of new associations while preserving the best of the old. One of the students asked me the other day, and it's something that's been heavy on my heart for about 3 years since I took employment at a Christian university. A friend of mine, many years ago at the University of South Carolina, this is my closing story. He said, why don't you take a moment, walk around campus of the University of South Carolina, and count the number of couples holding hands. I thought that guy was like nut. I was like, you got some drink, some alcohol in your cupboard there, buddy. And I took him up on his offer. I spent the day walking around campus looking for couples holding hands. My then girlfriend was with me. We counted 2 couples. We were one of them. We constituted 50% of those holding hands on that campus. I go to a faith-based institution, and I start seeing a similar pattern. And that, at a secular institution, that was bad enough. But when I go to an evangelical and Christian institution and I see that people aren't holding hands, they're not going out, sexes are separated, they seem to be scared of each other, I start getting worried. And I know that for many young people, there is concerns. Do you really want to bring children into a world? Do you really want to bring children into Reconstructed America? Yes. No question. Young people, go out, get married, start making your own associations. Bring new people into the world. That is the foundation of any good, natural, genuinely progressive social order. Make the world federal again means getting married first and having children and starting your own associations. Do not be afraid to build connections and relationships at every step of your life. Do not be worried about making friends, about joining churches, about loving people and developing stronger ties of kith and kin. We know what it's like to live in a reconstructed world. You can draw pride in your ancestors who made it through those dark days. You can be proud of them that they knew that the only way of enduring in this world was to build this kind of society. And I urge you to do so. That is what the South has to offer America, and that is what the South has to offer the world. Thank you.